All right, good morning, everyone. This is the Monday, October 10th meeting of the Planning, Housing, Economic Development Committee. We are continuing our work on ZTA 2201, which is about wireless infrastructure. And Ms. Nadeau has continued her work preparing the packet, considering memos and amendments and so forth. So I will turn to you to tee us up.
Good morning. So I'm going to just jump straight into the amendments. So starting at page 2 of the memo, the first was a request from Councilmember Friedson to clarify how the setback is measured. So I spoke with DPS, and I've actually attached a memo from DPS as well explaining how they measure, and it is not on the hypotenuse. It is measured horizontally. I think the example is you walk out your door 30 feet, you look straight up, and that's where the edge of the antenna or the box it's in will start. So that's the answer on the measurement question.
Great.
The next issue is preferential placement. First, I want to apologize. I had copied from a summary of the amendment. I will make sure to copy directly because I think there is an additional term about it being 5 feet from the door, so I'll copy that directly from 1907, so I wanted to apologize there. But the amendment here is to take the preferential placement language from 1907 and change the words, you strike the whole first sentence about when choosing a replacement pole or replacing a pre-existing pole, and change that to antenna, since this is the antenna existing structure section. So this would make sure, even on a strand mount, that the antenna is not directly in front of a front door, and it's preferably near an intersection. All that language about deciding where exactly they should be placed, with the caveat that they can provide an affidavit saying that the pole owner wouldn't give them permission to do that, or that there wasn't an alternate location, and that would be the only way they could place it closer to a door or not on that intersection. One thing I wanted to flag here is currently the setback has been, I think since at least since before the 2014 rewrite, I understand, the setback for antenna on existing structure has been 60 feet. So right now, when a provider places an antenna 60 feet or further, they do not have this requirement. So if this language is going to be added, there should be a decision on whether it's going to be added only between 30 and 60 feet or for everybody going forward. Ones that already exist will of course be grandfathered in. They won't be forced to change, but this would be changing 60 feet or further back, adding additional requirements that were not there previously at that distance. So those are the two. So that's the amendment itself, and then a question as to whether the committee wants language limiting it to just between 30 and 60 or for 30 and all the way back.
So I would certainly suggest just between 30 and 60. I mean, once you get beyond 60 feet, you're talking quite a ways away, and it may, I mean, I don't know, what's the, if it's 150 feet away, do we still have like a strong public interest in saying, no, you can't do it there, versus if that's the better place for wireless service? And so 60 feet is pretty far, that's, yeah. Colleagues, Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, I'm a little torn on this one, to be honest with you. I think on the one hand, I do understand that point, and the question, well, on the other hand, if this isn't an undue burden, it would be preferential, as is noted here, to be in the least obtrusive place possible, right? We prefer to be in certain places versus other places. My concern would be if we don't set a distance, is it infinity? I mean, just from a legal perspective, could it be from the house 6 blocks away? Because, I don't want to create a situation where it could prohibit everything, because it could be in front of somebody's door if it's a plane that goes from infinity to anywhere, any front door in the county. And I know that sounds far-fetched and hypothetical. I just don't want to run into an issue. So I'm sensitive there. But on the other hand, reasonably beyond 60 feet, I don't see it as being a huge challenged to have a preferential placement that's not in front of a front door and that, prefers to be, I think the intersection is actually the more, significant aspect here. So I got to be honest, I'm a little torn on that. I just wanted to throw those out there. I don't know if Councilmember Jawando has any thoughts, so I'd love to hear from council staff after Councilmember Jawando too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And maybe, I know we have our great Pepco team here and the pole replacement gurus. I just, the language just to remind council staff and us so that close to intersections, front-facing sides of residential properties, abutting non-residential properties, and not in front of residential doors. And if you can't state it, then you just got to do an affidavit or get permission. So the question is, I agree with Councilmember Friedson, that would be preferential, but how far out does that go? Assuming you could meet that before you got to infinity, I would assume. I would assume at some point before infinity you could meet the preference. So that would be my initial thought, but I want to hear from staff. And if you all have any comment on it, you can certainly step up, but go ahead.
So my note would be, I like the infinity analogy. So it'd be infinity until you hit the next front door. So it has to be, the setback is from any residential door. So if you picture a neighborhood, it would be infinity if you were in a field or an
Right.
area that doesn't have a lot of houses,
Right.
I suppose.
Right.
So eventually you will hit another residence and so have to be pushed back again. So I don't know if that answers the infinity question.
Boy, can I just ask a question? And also, what's in front? I mean, is it the width of the door projected on a straight path out?
So in 1907, it was 5 feet from the
5 feet on
area
either side?
between 2 parallel lines extending from the sides of the front door. So a 5-foot width in front of the front door.
I see. I mean, you could.
As a reminder, we can regulate aesthetics. So that is an aesthetic consideration. So I think the question is, without running into severe unintended consequences of the infinity problem, as I think we've discussed, is it unreasonable to have an aesthetic consideration? That would be preferable.
That you guys don't have a comment. I mean, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but okay, no comment on this piece. Okay, so I mean, no comments usually like it's okay, but at least that's the way I interpret it. So, yeah, I don't know.
I have a could we include it 60 to 120 feet, and then could we set a? I understand that the preferential would be an added dynamic that doesn't exist today that would be included in this zoning text amendment.
Right. So you could do so it'd be 30, so it'd be 30 to 100 or 30 to 120.
I'm just thinking if we,
Yeah.
you solve infinity by setting a number.
Yeah, number.
I mean,
Right.
I don't know exactly what that number would be, but
So the
90
number
feet,
would
120
be, the max number would be where you think an aesthetic requirement is reasonable and necessary, I suppose.
Right.
Because that's the only thing you're allowed to look at is that aesthetic requirement. So at what distance
And can't they just move the
do
pole
you not
5
mind
feet
anymore
over?
that it hasn't moved over?
Yes.
It's really a real protection.
And the pole is already there. That's the other caveat.
yeah,
The pole
just to be
itself is already there.
Clear,
so
they'd have
this
to
is
pick
the
a different
antenna.
pole. I mean, the whole purpose of this zoning text amendment is to put taking an existing pole and adding a structure, an antenna, onto an existing pole.
Mm-hmm.
And the rationale behind it is to create the preference to use existing utility poles as opposed to putting up new telecommunications poles.
Right.
I mean, that is the purpose here. So the question is, if somebody has a pole that's 61 feet out, 65 feet outside of their house, is it reasonable to say, place the structure on the next pole over? I mean, that's really, I just want to be clear, that's
Right.
what we're talking about. So I'll leave the judgment of whether that's a real protection to others, but that is the calculation that we are making here.
Assuming there is another existing structure that's over, in which case, then they would go through saying there wasn't a better alternative location.
Right.
I mean, as it is, it's also not clear whose front door, I guess it's anyone's front door. So on my street, there are 2 utility poles in front of my house. I don't think either of them is within this width out my front door, but it's possible one of them could be out the front door of my neighbor across the street. And so, my neighbor across the street would claim that the pole on my side of the street, which is really in front of my house, is in front of that person's front door.
And that issue would be compounded the further out you go, because the further
Right.
out you go, the more houses are now, the more front doors are now
The more
included.
people are in the mix, yeah.
Right.
So I don't know if there's you could also stop it at the curb. There's another geographic limit on it, the nearest curb. So that we're not getting into too much. But yeah, because then, but I also think once you're getting out, I mean, it's possible to locate a pole 3 feet to the side and no longer be in the zone.
Yes. Well, there's also, assuming if you were a corner property, then yes, that would be true. Because it's also, the language also tries to place it near that intersection. So if you were the corner property, it might still be 2 feet over from the edge of your door.
But in terms of mid-block poles, it sounds to me like they could replace a pole that's directly in front of your door and have the replacement be 5 feet to the side, and that would not be triggered.
Well, replacement, just to point out, replacement poles are a different standard. The pole would have to be determined as a utility pole, which would be determined by the Public Services Commission. So the telecommunications company, I mean, unless I'm mistaken here of what we're talking
Right.
about,
So if you change the word
telecommunications
pole
company
to
can't just
antenna.
say they want to put a pole next to it. The purpose of this zoning text amendment is to say we're talking about existing utility poles. That was the area that was not covered in 1907. That's what we're covering here. This is an additional facility on an existing pole. Now, if Pepco wanted to put a pole somewhere and that happened to be not within the 5-foot standard, then that would be allowed. But Pepco doesn't have to follow anything that we
Right.
require here because we're regulating the antenna. It just would be that their pole wouldn't be available for the use of a 5G antenna.
Right. And
I'm not arguing, I'm just trying to
Right.
clarify because I feel like we keep straying off into different scenarios that aren't what we're talking about here. This is
so putting the
a new
two-
facility, an antenna on, and I don't know if I have the right size. This is may not be to scale.
A little
I
bigger.
don't want anybody to hold me to that. I'm going to get yelled at for that. But on an existing pole, also maybe not to scale, also not to height. So, okay.
So to put the two uses together, you could have the existing utility pole is within that 5 feet width of your front door. And the preferential placement is saying, we'd really prefer you don't put it on that utility pole. But in terms of if they decided, okay, well then we're gonna put up a whole new tower, this same language applies to telecom towers. So either way, you wouldn't be able to do that if you add this amendment without getting this additional affidavit to get out of it. So that's where it would become consistent.
Which is just an affidavit saying that you got permission, or you couldn't get permission.
You couldn't get
Or you
permission.
couldn't find another location. So it's not a high bar, by the way, either, So I'd be fine.
I think 90 feet, I mean, set a standard. It gives a modest additional aesthetic protection for residents, and I don't think it's a significant burden, for the deployment of the facilities. So that would be my suggestion. If we hear, if there is a reason that we haven't considered here, before full council that, this would have an unintended consequence that we haven't discussed, then I'd be open to that, but that's where what I'd be thinking.
Okay,
Okay.
that's fine.
Okay.
90, is that the number we were going with, 90 feet?
Going
I have no
once,
preference on what the
going
number
once,
is.
going
I don't have a
twice.
recommendation for the number, so.
Fine.
You have a recommendation, or
I
you
do not have a
yet?
recommendation on the max number.
So it's,
number because of the infinity problem.
so the front door bandwidth extends to 90 feet. And it extends across the street as well?
Mhm.
So it's,
As it has, yeah.
okay, fine.
Okay, so the next amendment is pole proliferation. This is that an antenna must be at least 150 feet from an antenna owned by the same provider. It has the similar 30 to 60 foot setback issue. Do you want to limit it, have it go all the way back, also go with 90 feet? That's the decision here if you choose to go with this amendment. So this is the language to make sure you don't have like a crown castle antenna and then another one every 20 feet. They have to be at least 150 feet apart from their own antenna.
What's the reason why we wouldn't have this for everything?
It's the same aesthetic argument as with preferential placement. Although, truthfully here, the aesthetic argument I think is a little bit stronger because it's for each company, it's 150 feet, but you could do like Crown Castle, Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T. Like, so you could end up with more bunching than I believe you would with the preferential placement.
I think keeping it in general. I mean, 150 feet was not seen as an issue for deployment.
Mm-hmm.
And if 150 feet is not an issue for deployment, I'm not sure why why we would need to change it.
Sorry, the question here is, do you want that 150-foot rule to apply
Beyond
between
60
30 and
feet.
60 or beyond 60 feet?
Right, but if it doesn't inhibit deployment, in terms of having facilities that are close enough together within 60 feet, then I can't understand a scenario that it inhibits deployment beyond 60 feet. Like, if 150 feet isn't an issue of multiple facilities, then it's not an issue at all. The other one was different because it's in relationship to fixed points, and if you don't have a standard of when those fixed points end and it's a plane, then you could run into unintended issues that you didn't mean to do. But I don't think that's the same here, at least from my
Yeah,
perspective.
so you don't have, you're saying you don't have to have a distance?
Yeah, I don't-
because we're going this way and it's not about.
It's to each other.
Yeah.
Right. So the reason council staff flagged it is right now, they don't have this restriction at 60 feet. And
After 60
Yeah,
feet.
after 60
Oh, so we
feet,
would need
they
to
don't
apply.
currently
Have-
have this restriction.
More than every 100 feet.
Right.
Or we could set it as the same 90 feet for consistency. I mean, I don't think that it's an issue personally.
Look, I think this is why we're doing this. We're trying to reduce the
Yeah.
excessive proliferation. We want to have adequate proliferation and not excessive proliferation. And so that's why we need a zoning code amendment.
Yeah, so keep it with no restriction of distance.
150 feet from the nearest. I mean, the only thing I would say there, does this mean that, how do rooftops, do they come into play? If you're in a downtown area and Verizon has an antenna on the rooftop of an office building, and then they would like to add a new antenna to the
This is an antenna
utility pole,
on a utility pole.
Well,
That's what
the
I'm saying, yeah.
existing
Would that
structure
get
does
triggered?
include some types of buildings. So I think one of them was like a barn, a silo. There's like a
Can we
list
just-
of types of existing structures.
Yeah.
So yes, those would be included.
those would get triggered. So can we
Right.
limit this to utility poles? Is it like two, I'm,
Can I just, we're talking about whether we go beyond 60 feet. By definition, if we're talking about on a building, we are at 0 feet, unless I'm missing something.
So it's if
Like,
you,
if you're on a building, you're well within the 60-foot threshold of a building.
so I think
So unless I'm.
Councilmember Reamer's question is, if the existing structure, if the antenna on existing structure is being placed, let's say, on a barn or a building, so that's what the existing structure
Yes,
is.
yeah.
Then if you were the house across the street downtown, let's say, how would that apply? And one caveat I'll add here is 1907, remember, was mostly making these changes for residential, not commercial. So that's another piece as well. Sorry, not to complicate it further.
Yeah, but again, if we're saying 150 feet from each other, and it would be within 60 feet, no matter what, that's, I mean, assuming we move forward with this, and the question that you are raising to us is whether it goes from 61 feet to infinity, or somewhere less than infinity, then if the 150 feet isn't a problem on the building, I'm having trouble understanding, what the issue that we'd be trying to solve. Like,
Sorry, I was just trying to make sure. What I was saying is, picturing downtown Silver Spring in my mind, the World Building, tons of antennas on top of the World Building. If one of the companies wanted to add an antenna on the street to a utility pole, would they be allowed to do that if they are closer than 150 feet to the antennas on top of the World Building?
Not with this amendment,
Not
no.
with this amendment. So I think this is an issue intended for the residential zone. I guess that's what I'm really saying. And it may not be one that we want applying everywhere in the county, because we would want the deployment on utility poles and lights in urban areas, but those urban areas are already, they have antennas all over the rooftops. And so I think we
Right.
could just exempt certain zones from this specific one to ensure that what we're trying to do is limit the neighborhood proliferation.
And that was the purpose of flagging the issue, is right now, they haven't had that limit. So with this
Exactly.
amendment, going forward, they would have that limit.
so are you suggesting that we
Make commercial
exempt, all the commercial zones, CR, CRN?
That's my immediate reaction here, is that I think that is what we're seeking to do, is this is not something we're concerned about in an urban area. We're only concerned about this in the residential neighborhood setting. So we could say that, and then we can seek feedback as to whether that does it right.
So what I can do is confirm if there's a way to do it not, or only in residential zones.
Right, it would just apply, and you'd list the zones, I assume, but I'm not the attorney.
There's two different standards, I just want to make sure. One is making sure it doesn't apply in urban zones, in urban areas. The other would be making sure that it only applies in residential areas. The reason why I say that is defining what a residential area, that's a broader question and conversation. Like if our focus here is the very urbanized areas of the county, CR zone specifically, let's say, then that's a different standard than, because there's quite a bit of kind of transitional
So there might be some
zones that are in
fine-tuning
neighborhoods
of-
that aren't residential
Right.
zones, that what would we consider those?
Well, you also have like
like a CRT.
thousands of people living in downtown Silver
Yeah,
Spring,
yeah.
too, next to the. those-
And I will just point out, one of the conversations that we had during 1907 was specifically the equity conversation between urban communities and urban areas where people don't just work, people don't just go to shop and to go have dinner, people live, including me, by the way. But, and having a totally different standard in residential zones that are primarily single-family, maybe townhouse. So I think we need to be sensitive to that consideration too, because that was one of the big conversations that we had during the discussion of 1907. If the question here is consistency between the two zoning text amendments, I think, we need to be careful
Well,
about that.
1907 was allowing it in residential areas because it had already been
It's already in
previously
commercial,
allowed in urban areas, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
in commercial zoned areas. So, okay, I think we are in agreement here about what we're trying to do, which I would suggest it is exempting the CR, CRN, CRT,
The
employment,
commercial, residential,
employment
industrial, and
zones,
employment.
everything that's essentially not R60, R90, R200 or something like that.
And from 30 feet all the way back, correct? Or to the 90?
I mean, I feel like we had that conversation. If we're talking about 150 feet, you don't really need to worry
Okay.
about how far. So I think all the way out,
Okay.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would just be helpful for council staff to share with us all of the zones that are under consideration and
Right.
maybe even mapping out, just so we understand what we're talking about.
So
before we go to full
usually,
council.
the categories, if you can picture the use table, which I know, not everybody pictures it all the time like I do.
Every night
but-
before I go to bed, I picture the zoning use
You
table.
too. So it is color coded, and it goes like agricultural, rural, residential, residential. And then there's commercial, residential, industrial, employment. So that's probably where council staff would recommend that split. But know that some of those commercial, residential could be downtown Silver Spring in those urban areas,
Which are also residential.
which are technically residential, but we
Right.
call them commercial
Well, the irony
residential.
here is, not to go down another path, but people who live in apartment and condo buildings have had antennas on their buildings for decades. And first of all, there's never been any documented health outcome in any way whatsoever. Never, ever. Despite living with dozens of antennas on their rooftops. And secondly, this whole issue is that single-family homeowners don't want to have to live in proximity to antennas that people who live in multifamily dwellings live with. And, make of that what you will. But, okay.
So, I guess I'll address this quick scheduling thing as we go forward. So the tentative plan is for this to go to full council for work session on the 18th, which is next Tuesday, and then for action on the 25th. So any amendments that council staff's going to look into will be reflected in the council packet, and I'll note the FED committee's discussion of that amendment and what your intent and what you were looking for is.
Okay.
Does that work? Because I know we're getting down to the wire on the zoning scheduling.
So to speak. Down to the fiber.
So, sorry, I did not mean to make a pun, I promise. So the next issue is removal. So for telecom towers in 1907, it basically came out to about 180 days that if it was deactivated, it had to be removed. So I believe last week when FED committee met, there was a discussion of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, what makes sense. I reached out to DPS. They said the only issue here is the provider, in order to remove that antenna, would need to get a right-of-way permit, and DPS was confident they could issue that within 30 days. So 30 days should be sufficient.
Great.
The next issue is height. So this is the discussion of how to limit the height of the antenna on the existing structure. As noted, we don't regulate the height of utility poles, so that gets tricky. So you're deciding how high the antenna can be on that pole. I reached out to DPS, Crown Castle, Pepco, various interested stakeholders, so to speak. And the background is utility poles have a lot of different equipment, not just antennas. And there's a lot of different spacing requirements due to safety issues for both the public and the workers. So the utility companies in that way decide the best way to space everything out safely, which would include something like how high it can go, because that affects how you're spacing everything out. So there are some of the practical effects of limiting the height in terms of what the aesthetic goal is. Are we trying to there is a minimum of 15 feet, so it'll never be lower than 15 feet off the ground, any antenna. So in terms of like straight sight lines, that's that height issue. The tree canopy issue came up, but again, sometimes because of those safety and spacing requirements, the antennas are placed on top of the utility pole. So in order to regulate the height of that antenna, you'd in a way need to know the height of the utility pole. So at best, the amendment would be how much higher the utility pole could go. But again, there might be technical specification in terms of how that would work for Pepco. From what I hear from Tower Committee, I think it ends up being about 10 to 15 feet higher at most. So you could set the limit there since that's what they're doing anyways. But those are the considerations in terms of regulating height.
Could you clarify 10 to 15 feet higher You're saying that that's what they, meaning the tower committee, does anyway, 10 to 15 feet higher. Could you just clarify what you mean?
That's my
For those watching, I'm not sure they're
understanding, yes.
following what.
That is
so if
the
you could just
additional height that gets
explain.
added to the utility pole, as far as I understand.
So if there was additional piece of equipment that was being placed on a utility pole that needed to have a distance from other equipment for a variety of safety reasons, including a person who is installing it and other considerations, 10 to 15 feet would be the standard. So the issue here is, just to be clear, I mean, if you all want to come up, but on a pole that is a telecommunications tower that the council and the county has the legal authority to regulate, we can say what the pole can and can't be. A utility pole, we do not regulate. The PSC at the state level regulates. And so they determine not only the height of the pole, but all the other equipment on the pole and how it is spaced, whether it can be on the pole and how it is spaced along the pole. All we can regulate is say where a telecommunications pole can or can't be, or how high it can or cannot be placed, which would play a role in how that interfaces with the other equipment, or whether it could be deployed with other equipment that the PSC would then have to determine. If you use our restriction on a 5G antenna, if that would work with the other equipment that would be needed, and if it wouldn't, then they would just have to find another location. Is that correct?
That is an accurate statement.
Press your mic.
They can't, yeah. We can hear you, but they can't hear you if they're streaming.
Technical difficulty, sorry about that. That is an accurate statement. Typically, communication lines, including antenna attachments, per NESC code, need to be 5 feet from energized power lines.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad we clarified that. I'll turn to colleagues now. I just want to make sure we understand what we're talking about. We're talking about whether or not we can't control the pole. The question is whether or not we set a standard specifically for an antenna being placed on a pole, and how that interfaces with other equipment that may or may not be on that utility pole, which is regulated by the PSC at the state level.
So, can you just explain why, I'm inclined to agree with your staff recommendation here, which is that we stay out of this dimension here. Can you just expand on that?
So that was the staff recommendation based on just the state and all the safety and licensing requirements around the height. I think from council staff's recommendation, it's probably best to leave this one alone because so many technical considerations do need to go into the placement. And I will note that these still go to tower committee. They still get looked at by the county. It's not PEPCO puts them up and nobody knows. So that was why council staff recommended leaving the height issue alone.
So I'm with you there. I think we found that it's very complex, and it could be unintended consequences. I'd hate to have the next council have to go through this.
I will note, because it was raised in some testimony we received, I apologize, a question about tree canopy. So 1907 did have tree loss language. I will note that was non-binding language, so it was when doing these, county executive, if you could try to make sure that we're not cutting down too many trees to accommodate these. That was something in 1907. It wasn't like the sort of non-binding language at the end. So if that helps this height issue in terms of tree canopy loss, that could be
Turn
added.
to my colleague. I just want to make the observation that, depending on the size of the trees, you have street trees that don't grow to a great height. And in that block, you want a taller pole to get the antenna away from the tree. So there's no one size fits all. But I'll just pass to my colleagues.
Appreciate that. I had this flag that I was going to raise after Councilmember Jawando spoke, but since you raised it, I'm going to step in with his allowance, which I appreciate. Is there any reason why we couldn't include non-binding language here to just request that the tower committee consider the, yeah.
Sorry, I'm trying to find the exact language.
So without setting a specific number, setting a height that mitigates aesthetics, aesthetic concerns, and doesn't interrupt tree canopy.
So the language reads, the county executive must include tree loss minimization language in all franchise and license agreements signed after the effective date of this ZTA. Critical damage to the root zones of trees as well as excessive pruning should be avoided in the installation of telecommunications towers, regardless of whether they are installed on a new, pre-existing, or replacement pole. So of course that would be tweaked to say antennas and not replacement towers, but that's how the language read. So it really was talking about language the county executives being asked to put in the franchise and
It's the
license
franchise
agreements.
agreement, not necessarily, okay.
A zoning issue. That's why it was non-binding, because it's not technically a zoning matter, so it couldn't be part of the official zoning ordinance.
Yeah, I'd personally, I understand the concern about specifying the height because of the other safety-related considerations related to a utility pole and how it's state overseen, not county, but I do think non-binding language specifically related to tree canopy would be helpful here, so I think we should move that forward. I'll yield to you, Councilmember Jawando. Thanks for your indulgence.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fine, and stay out of the specific numbers of the height, but include that consistent language. I'm fine with that.
Sounds good.
Next up is maintenance. So this is just requiring the owner of the antenna to maintain the antenna. It specifically says, must maintain the antenna and equipment in safe condition. The owner is responsible for removing graffiti and repairing any damage to the antenna. A quick note here, they would likely need to get a right-of-way permit to do that maintenance, but that's what that language would look like. I did want to flag there are different maintenance requirements depending what the existing structure itself is, so you might get the antenna cleaned up, but the rest of the pole is not. Not a reason to not do this, I just wanted to flag that.
Can we let the legislative record reflect that if there is graffiti on a utility pole that includes an antenna, that if the telecommunications company is cleaning the graffiti off of the antenna structure, that we would very much hope that the utility would clean the graffiti off of the pole or work with the companies to work together to clean all of the graffiti off of the entire structure? I see a nod to say that that was heard, but my view on this, and I talked to council staff about this previously, I'm still comfortable moving this forward because we can control what we can control, and we do want things to be in good working condition, and we do want them to be aesthetically appropriate and well kept and in good working order, and we should set that standard and hope that others that we don't control are following suit. I don't think we should not make sure that the equipment that we regulate are in good working order and are in appropriate condition, because we can't control everything. So to me, I think it's fine.
Yeah, I agree. And I saw our present utility nod. So, but yeah, if there's a water tower that has graffiti on it and you're cleaning the pole, we want you to, or fixing the antenna. There you go. We want you to scrub that graffiti too, if you can. But yeah, I think it's fine to include.
And then the last proposed amendment in the council staff packet is about notice. This was, I believe Councilmember Jawando had asked, is there anything else in 1907 that isn't in 2201? And I'd flagged notice requirements. The issue here is in 1907, those notice requirements were usually triggered because it was a conditional use or waiver and objection, where we had lots of the mailing out and putting up signs. Antenna on existing structure remains a limited use, and we don't do that type of notice for limited uses. I did speak to DPS about the types of notice that can be done. So for example, putting a sign up to say construction is happening. One concern here is usually signs are only required for construction on a residential property. So you're the homeowner, you see that sign is still there. there's rain, wind, signs blowing around. If it's in the right of way, it's a bit harder to control that those signs are being maintained, placed properly. I believe DPS sends an inspector out to go look at the signs as well. So it's creating a bit of labor. In addition, there's no actual public forum for a limited use. You meet the standards, you get the application. So it would quite literally just be notice, not saying here's a hearing, submit objection, et cetera. It's just letting people know this is happening here. So that's the caveat there with the notice, is we typically don't do notice like this for limited uses, especially when they're not on a residential property, but I did want to add that.
And you also noted in here, which I think is important for the millions watching at home, that the Tower Committee will have all the applications up for any new antenna.
And I will confirm that it still exists and it's still working, but I think you can even like sign up to be on their distribution list, I believe. I think that is still an option. I can
Yeah,
double check that.
if you want to know. Okay.
We're getting nods in the back from the executive branch. I just want to acknowledge there's members of the executive branch that are present, and they're nodding that you can sign up to get notice. So I just so folks who are watching at home can see that.
If this was something that concerned you, you could sign up. If you have concerns about whether an antenna would be installed in your neighborhood, you can sign up for notification from the Tower Committee, and you can review applications that are received.
Go ahead, come on down if you have a comment on that. She needs a chair, I think. It's rough here for the executive branch. You got to stand up at the mic. Just press.
Separation of powers.
Hi, I'm Debbie Spielberg with the County Executive's Office, and just wanted to clarify, yes, there are notifications. You can sign up for notifications about Tower Committee hearings, but I did want to clarify, right now there's no public process for the public to participate in those Tower Committee meetings. That's one of the things we're looking at. So I just didn't want any confusion about what then happens. So that's all I wanted to do.
Thank you. All right.
So, no amendments there.
So that was the last amendment in the council staff packet, but if committee members have other amendments or questions or suggestions, again, we have PEPCO and Crown Castle and DPS and the executive and lots of people here for all your questions before this goes to council.
And we do have another topic, which is the master licensing agreement.
Yes.
So we will continue our discussion. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, thank you. One of the issues that was raised, and we kind of hinted at it prior in the conversation, but I'm not sure we fully honed in on it, is the question of whether antenna, as we're defining it in the zoning text amendment, relates to all of the equipment related to the antenna. My assumption was when we say antenna, that means if you have equipment that's part of the antenna, that's the antenna. But this was an issue that was raised, and so I want to make sure that the language we used reflects what we're intending it to mean.
So the definition of antenna on existing structure says one or more antennas attached to an existing support structure, lists the different types, and then says antenna on existing structure includes related equipment. So this might actually be a quick DPS question, but I'm assuming this is about the question's about the measurement issue especially. So they measure from the antenna and its equipment. That's how DPS is currently doing it. If the committee is concerned that there could be a change in how that's done, every time it says antenna in regard to measurement, I could change it to capitalized antenna on existing structure, since that definition does include the equipment. If that was a helpful clarification, assuming that doesn't raise technical concerns for PEPCO.
Are there any technical concerns of including antenna on existing structure when antenna, little a antenna is mentioned, so that it's the big A antenna on existing structure as defined?
William Ellis, PEPCO, no concerns when we think about the antenna as well as the other equipment associated with that antenna needed to power or process the signal from that antenna. No concerns, whether it's from height restrictions or setback restrictions.
Yeah, I think it's a helpful suggestion if colleagues are in agreement. Just to clarify that, that was my assumption. I assume that was the assumption of colleagues as well, based on our discussions last week and this week. But it was raised by some residents, and I think it's important that we clarify that so everybody understands what we're talking about.
All right. Any concerns with that? All good? Okay, so any objection? Okay, we have an amended ZTA. So, all those in favor, show of hands. All right, thank you to my colleagues. We will move this to the full council. Now to the master licensing agreement. So, maybe my cache is not refreshing, but when I click on the master licensing update, it says there's no material for this item.
There was not a packet for this item. Council staff's understanding was that the county executive would just provide an update, so there weren't any materials about it.
Still no materials. So in March of 2021, we were told that the county executive had a draft of the master licensing agreement, and it was going to be imminently finished with it. You're smiling. In 2022, as we took this up, we were told it was imminent. It will be coming. The executive branch is obstructing the deployment of this infrastructure by sitting on this master licensing agreement. Just as the executive has opposed every single ZTA, every attempt to allow for modernity through wireless to encroach in Montgomery County, he has obstructed the deployment of this infrastructure by withholding this license agreement. It's outrageous. I mean, this is a business and economic development issue, and holding up the deployment of this infrastructure. When are we going to have the draft master license agreement?
Hi again, I'm Debbie Spielberg with the County Executive's Office. So there was a draft put out in the spring of this year. There were red lines returned from the telecom companies, and there were public comments received. And there has been a delay on going through that. We're trying to, part of our delay is we use an outside counsel who was extremely talented and knowledgeable. He'd been very sick over the last year, and he died in June. So we have been a little bit without the outside help. He had been really helpful a year ago, August, and so we've been struggling with trying to get up to speed. That being said, we have reviewed the red line comments, still reviewing the public comments, and as was discussed earlier, there are issues around public engagement and public process we're trying to figure out. I would just say the county executive is not in any way trying to obstruct modernization. In fact, we've been doing a number of projects to expand broadband access, and especially to low income and other communities that have difficulty reaching it. So it's not about that, it's that these are county-owned structures. They're county-owned structures in many residential areas, and we just want to make sure that we're doing it correctly.
The companies have been granted the right to deploy the infrastructure through the zoning code, but they can't do it until they can sign a memo. It's been years since the county council, through a torturous, difficult process, resolved issues in the urban areas, which the county executive has bragged about having, the county has already taken action on many times publicly. Oh, we've already done this. We passed a zoning code for the urban areas, but they can't deploy because he won't complete the master license agreement. So even while he's taking credit publicly for moving forward on 5G, he's actually blocking the deployment of that 5G in the places that he's taking credit for allowing it. Am I wrong?
I would disagree with your characterization. We've not heard a lot about the urban areas and what's needed. What we've mostly been hearing about is the residential areas, and folks wanting to go into residential areas that currently, that have the street lights. So I would say that.
So when are we going to receive the completed master license agreement?
I'm not going to attempt to give you an actual date. I think we're really close to sending it back to the companies and having a further conversation. That's between our attorneys and the companies, and then there's the public comments as well, which may require a revised process because they're
I
raising
mean, this
some
is,
very important
this
issues.
is obstruction. That's all this is obstruction. This is the executive taking unilateral action to prevent the deployment of infrastructure that the county council has allowed.
I
All
would just-
right,
There's, in your packet is the number of applications of antenna attachments. So antennas are being placed all over the county on an ongoing basis.
right, on county-owned infrastructure. So, Lou, there's some confusion around existing infrastructure. Can you just explain what we're hearing?
Yeah, so council staff received a call on Friday from Crown Castle that the application, when you apply to do an antenna before Tower Committee, I think the choices, and you can confirm this, Debbie, the choices on the application are I think it's a new tower or it's a co-location, and the companies, their concern is if it's being placed on an existing structure or it's a replacement, it's being called new, which has different standards than co-location. So the question was whether that application should be amended to have terms that are consistent with what's in the zoning ordinance to make it easier for the providers to follow. The problem here is that council doesn't draft those, the regs in terms of, it's an executive regulation, like what the application says, what the fees are, all of that. I believe it's method 2. It might be method 3, but I think it's method 2, of how the application itself categorizes the different uses.
I would also say we're soon sending over proposed revised regulations. And I just learned about this issue this morning, so it's duly noted.
Thank you.
Is this in the ZTA that this needs to be adjusted, or is this in the MLA, the Master License Agreement, or where is it?
No, it would be an executive reg. It's not something in, so the zoning ordinance has various terms that we've talked about. It has antenna on existing structure, it has replacement towers, it has existing towers. So the issue is just making sure, to make it easier for everybody involved, that if the application uses the same terms, so DPS knows what they're applying for, Tower Committee knows that they're applying for, just so everyone knows which we're talking about, because there are so many different terms. But that is an executive regulation. It sounds like they'll be sending those over shortly.
Okay. So,
But I believe it is method 2, to be honest, which means council would look at those.
so, Ms. Spielberg, when will the MLA go to the telecom partners?
I can't tell you exactly. I'm hopeful soon. We're definitely working on it. We're back and forth. So I think it's pretty close to go back to them to have a conversation.
Can we do it by the 15th of October?
Certainly try, yes.
All right. Okay. Anything else? All right, thanks.
I would just say on the master license, and on the secondary issue, just keep us posted. If you have an issue, just let us know. I don't think, you're right, polls are going up, but I just think the communication has continued to be a challenge, and I don't ascribe it ill intent necessarily, but when you get the same answer multiple times and you don't have any communication in between, that's difficult for us. So if you could just take that back, and I just wanted to say that on the record.
Happy to. And just on the notes of communications, just want to make sure you guys saw the county executive's 2 memos on 2201.
Yes.
Because only one page of one was included in the packet, so, but maybe in the full council.
Yeah, it'll all.
Yeah, like, have it here, and I appreciate it, and I know the county executive doesn't agree with this, but it's helpful information, and maybe at full council we can discuss. I didn't feel like, the why you made this suggestion, but I think some might want to bring it up, but it'll be in the full council packet, I'm sure. So, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I just feel like the executive doesn't support what we're trying to do, and that's why we're not receiving the MLA. But the council has acted. The council has said this must be allowed. And so really, the executive, it's incumbent upon the executive, whether he doesn't have to agree with it. Just because he has to draft the regulation or the license agreement and sign it, send it to it, doesn't have to agree with it.
Just to correct the record, I don't think it's a question of whether he agrees with it or not. It's a brand-new area, because now we're dealing with county-owned polls, and so the question is, once you start with something, you want to make sure that you do it appropriately and to protect the public interest, and it's just taken longer. It's incredibly complicated, and so it's just taking much longer. There's no intent to delay. I believe he voted for the ZTA, so.
He voted for the previous ZTA.
For the
not for-
1802. So it's not an intent to delay. It's just trying to get it right.
Well, we need the administration to act. Thank you. And communicate.
Yeah, I want to just, I guess, since everybody's on the record here, I don't want to be seen as not on the record on these issues. And I just want to associate myself with Councilmember Jawando's point. We need to have better and more ongoing communication on these issues. I think there's a recognition when things can be complicated, things happen, you hired somebody, there are health issues, there have been, there's a tragedy related to that, unfortunately. We're all very sorry about that loss, but none of that was communicated in real time. And so it shouldn't require us to have hearings here about related issues to then hear about what is happening and why things aren't moving with the speed and fidelity that we would all expect and are not consistent necessarily with the timing that we have been told. So I'm not ascribing motivation here either, but the fact remains we don't hear about what's going on and things are not happening, and that is a very challenging dynamic for the public interest to see both branches of government working together, even when there's disagreement, which is understandable, to fulfill obligations that we all have. So thank you.
Duly noted, and just would note again, it's not an issue of disagreement. It's an issue of how do we do this appropriately.
Okay, so we have the 17th of October, we have a PHED committee session, 7 days. Could we have the MLA then?
I will. I don't think we'd have something to share with the committee at that time because it's still a back and forth about the wording within the MLA.
Could we ask on the 17th, we'll have another update, and we'll ask you to share what exactly specifically are the issues, the language, the words that you're still working on?
I will take a look. There are 3 different companies who have commented, so there are 3 different sets of issues. There's also numerous residents who have commented with some very valuable. So we can, let me think through how we could characterize all that for you, summarize that for you.
Could I suggest, could you consult with the county attorney if there is an issue here related to an ongoing contract dispute, that if it needs to be in closed session, it can be in closed session if that is what is legally required. But either way, there is no reason why the council can't be briefed on even an ongoing contract discussion. Not saying the council needs to be involved in contract discussions, it shouldn't be, but we should be aware of what is happening on the execution of policy issues that the council has has legislated, here. So
Could have a committee closed session.
one way or another, I think, and we can continue this conversation online, but it doesn't seem unreasonable for the council and this committee specifically to be briefed on what's going on.
Yeah. Happy
And
to.
I don't think it's reasonable for us to continue to say these things are complicated and lots of people have lots of different perspectives and we're working through it. Eventually, we need to know what's going on. And right now, we have not been made aware specifically of where things are and told how they are going to be concluded and when they're going to be concluded.
So, I think I'm on. So I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. It was put out to the public and to the companies for everyone to review. They sent back red line copies. We've now reviewed all the red line copies and are having an internal conversation about what the appropriate responses are with our attorney, and those should be going back to the telecom companies. I'm just not sure how fast that's happening. And then kind of separately, but at the same time, is reviewing the public comments, which is a slightly different process because it's not commenting necessarily direct. There were no red lines to review, and so it's trying to figure out how that fits in. But happy to fill in more at a future session, if that makes sense.
The challenge that you're having is how the public will comment on applications, right?
No. It was back when we put the MLA out for public comment in March. The public various residents weighed in with comments on the MLA. Some of them were not directly related to the MLA, but some were, and so that's the part that kind of got a little bit overlooked or haven't quite figured out how to incorporate. But also the Telecom sent back actual red line copies of the MLA with their comments, and it doesn't seem like there's anything insurmountable. Certainly, so.
I don't think the question is whether or not it's insurmountable. The question is timing.
Mm-hmm.
And it does feel like we're getting into the indefinite phase of timing. And that's the frustrating thing here, where there's no deadline. There's ongoing complicated conversations that are happening. There is ongoing consideration. And, you're saying see you later, and we're saying when are we going to see you? That's the problem. And so we got to get to a point where, you said that the comments were received in March?
No, it was put out in March.
And when were the comments, was there a deadline set for when public comment would be received until?
I think it was April or May. I'd have to go back and look.
Okay, we're in October, we're fast approaching November. This is how things work. And so residents should be given adequate time, but reasonable set of time. They were given a time that their comments were finished, then there had to be a time to review those comments, and then we should be here at the end of that process, and it's just not moving to the extent that it appears that it's happening, and that's the challenge. I think we all understand that things take time, but the time here is far more indefinite than I think any of us feel is appropriate.
So we will ask, so we'll have an update on the 17th. We'll ask you to come back for that. And Ms. Spielberg, thank you for coming back for that. And please share with council staff what some of the sticking points are that you're working through so that we can understand. I don't know that whether we have any, the issues that you said were raised in public testimony and your response to them, public comment and your response to them, I'm guessing those are the ones that are more germane to our, the rest of the stuff is just your two sides doing your negotiation. But, I think we need to look at everything. And get this resolved. I mean, we can't allow this to bleed into the next council. I mean, there's just no reason for that. So put this chapter, close the book on this chapter or whatever. Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.